happened in their past. And then vice versa, what is our countertransference? How are we feeling because of how this person is reacting to us, you know, or what they're sending out, you know, our way in terms of their attitude, in terms of their behavior, perhaps even in terms of their words. And so, so let's go right into that. And again, please feel free to you know, jump in and ask a question at any point in time, or I can just go through this and then we'll go ahead and obviously have questions and answers toward the end. So Peter, will I be able to share here my screen already, or? I think you're muted.
I need you to share with, can you email, I need you to share, can you send me an email of your presentation?
Oh, okay. So let me just do that then real quick.
Okay. So I'm looking for it now, Marcus. So
Yeah, it's there on its way.
okay, just a second. It might take a second to come through.
Holly, did you send yours?
No, I'm sending it now.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I may have to send a Google Drive link because it's going to be, it might be
Too big. Okay, I'm still looking here. Let's see. Oh dear. I don't see it yet, Marcos. Did you send it to?
I sent it to the NYSC
Oh, you sent it to the other one. Okay.
Albany, something Albany at Gmail.
Okay, I gotcha. Okay, I see PowerPoint transference.
Yes.
Okay.
Peter, I'm sending mine to your Gmail address. So this way you can open a link.
Okay, great. Okay. Let's see. Okay, how's that?
I can see it.
Good. Okay, we're good.
All righty. And so I guess I'll let you know when to go to the next screen, right?
Yeah, I'll just click for you.
Okay, cool. So we can go on to the second slide.
Okay.
All righty. So setting the record straight, right? So I just want to get one thing out of the way, and that is that, and sometimes it is a misconception, but the one thing we all need to really understand is that we all right? So when we talk about transference and countertransference, we're really talking about transferring, right? So whether we are transferring on to others because of our past experiences, because of you know, the cards we've been dealt throughout life, because of traumatic experiences, or we are counter-transferring what someone else has transferred onto us for the same reason, because of their past experiences with individuals in their lives. Um, Obviously, you know, parents have a major impact on how we react to, you know, in our upbringing, by the way, has a lot to do with how we react to others. So, but the one thing I just want to get straight is that we all transfer and we all counter transfer all the time in every encounter. So it's interesting because when I speak to my CPE students, um, there are times in their case studies where they'll say things like, "Oh, there was I didn't you know I didn't transfer this during this visit, or I didn't counter transfers." And it's quite interesting because we basically transfer and counter transfer all the time. And I know we hear this in psychology, and we hear this, you know, and you know, obviously social workers get this kind of training, but we're gonna, you know, we're gonna point it in the direction of spiritual care at the moment, you know. And so the one thing I just want you to know throughout this little session is that you want to keep in your mind that you're constantly transferring and counter transferring, even in daily life, even in dealing with family and colleagues. You're doing this. But for the sake of this training, you know, in terms of being a spiritual care provider, I want you to understand that every time you're visiting your client, every time you're visiting an inmate, every time you're visiting a patient, and so on and so forth, you are usually either transferring, but most of the time, because we're visiting and we're there for them, we are counter transferring, right? In other words, we are reacting because of our past, because of what they've sent our way in terms of what they're transferring onto us. We are reacting or counter transferring in every one of our visits, in every one of our encounters. Next slide, please. So I guess the question is, what is transference, right? And so there are long, you know, I actually have a video, and I'll play a summary video at the end of this if it's possible. I'm not sure if it's possible because of the way we're doing this here, because I'm not actually sharing my screen. But nonetheless, you know, what is the basic? And I'm trying to keep it very, very elementary, because I find that that's the best way I've been able to deal with transference and counter-transference, and moreover, learn about it and be able to share it with others. It's basically defined as a client's unconscious conflicts that can cause problems in everyday life. So it is something that is going on within each and every one of us, right? And it's usually conflicts that we may have that we don't even notice. It's done unconsciously. It's something that has been embedded basically in us because of our past, because of what we've gone through in life, because of perhaps a traumatic experience, because of our relationship with our children, because of our relationship with our authoritative figures, whether they are our spiritual, you know, leaders or bosses or supervisors, et cetera, et cetera. So we've gone through things. We have these conflicts unconsciously have caused a change in us and how we see the world and perhaps how we see others. And this is happening within us. And in many cases, if especially we're going to talk about negative transference, if it's a conflict, obviously something that, you know, that is detrimental to us, then it's causing problems pretty much every day for us. Some of it is so subtle that we don't even notice it. It's going on every day and we don't notice it. And then some of it, once we start to learn about this, once we start to reflect on it, we start to realize, wow, this is something that I'm going to have to work on. And that's my hope and that's my prayer with this type of training whenever I do give this type of training. Next slide, Peter. So let's look at the opposite, right? What is counter-transference? Well, exactly what it says, right? Counter-transferring. So someone has transferred onto you because of what you represent to them, because of their internal conflicts. They've transferred onto you. And in turn, you as the provider, in this case, the spiritual care provider, you are now counter-transferring. So a couple of things. So there's two ways to look at this, right? When we look at it in terms of psychology, when we look at it in terms of therapy, usually, okay, well, we're counter-transferring because of what has happened to us in our past, what we're carrying with us, what conflicts we're carrying with us. So that's part of it. But also, I just want you to also just focus as a spiritual care provider on the fact that we are counter-transferring because of how they're reacting to us, right? Which reminds us of something in our past. But this is having an effect, a profound effect on our visit and how the visit goes, okay? And this can actually make the difference between having a productive visit with our client, right? Or a non-productive visit with our client. And so that's why this is so important, is because, you know, the more we can try to deal with what's going on inside of us, and the more we can try to recognize when we're transferring or counter-transferring, the better the outcome. So I just want to, you know, put that out there. But again, very simply put, when you find yourself basically responding back to the way the individual is responding to you or treating you. Okay. Next slide, Peter. So, transferring. All right, let's talk about it for, you know, and I like to use the word transferring because sometimes people like the words transference or counter-transference might confuse some. I know it does to me, but basically that's what we're talking about. We're talking about transferring, all right? So it is where the individual transfers, right, the feelings and attitudes from a person or a situation in the past onto a person or situation in the present. So if you have had some sort of a positive experience or negative experience with people in your past, okay, with people in your past, we can actually look at that as an example I like to use, especially these days, with everything that we've got going on with, you know, the Black Lives Matter and all the civil rights issues that we've been dealing with and paying attention to. Sometimes, and I know that this happens in my neighborhood here in New York and the different precincts I work at, you know, if that individual has had a traumatic or a negative relationship or past with law enforcement, for instance, chances are that whenever they encounter law enforcement, they're going to transfer how they feel about law enforcement. They're going to transfer onto that officer how they feel, or that agent, how they feel about law enforcement, which may be a positive thing, or it may be, in many cases, as we've seen, a negative thing right off the bat. So it doesn't necessarily even mean that this officer had to do anything, but just his presence, that uniform, that authoritative figure will go ahead and cause this individual to transfer in a negative way if they've had negative experiences in the past. That in turn is going to cause that officer and agent to also counter-transfer onto that individual, okay? So next slide, Peter. So again, regarding to transferring, the individual, again, transfers, right? In this case, where we were just, the example I was using, the feelings based upon feelings experienced with influential people and early life experiences onto you. Okay. So if this young person, this young man, this young woman had a very negative experience or early on in her life, saw law enforcement, for instance, as a threat, right? Or as a child was apprehended in some park or was trespassing or not even, perhaps not even knowing that they were trespassing, and they were roughly, and harshly handled by this law enforcement person when they were kids. And you've seen it on television. Sometimes you'll have law enforcement do, make some mistakes and have a child being handcuffed, for instance, a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old. We've had these kind of situations, and, put in the back of a squad car. Well, this experience is going to stay, right, with this child pretty much forever. And so as they grow up and as they're older, every time they encounter law enforcement, even if it's not for them, possibly even just seeing them at a distance, that is going to trigger feelings and emotions inside that individual. All right. And in the case, when that encounter does happen, that individual, right, is going to react in a certain way toward that law enforcement agent or that law enforcement officer. And many times it's negative. And so depending on what that officer has been through, that officer is going to counter transfer in a negative way, or may even be able to counter transfer in a positive way if they are in tune with themselves, which is the purpose of this, is how do we get in tune with ourselves to see this happening within ourselves so that we can have more productive visits. Next slide, Peter. So obviously, like as I said before, we have two types of transferences in many instances, and we're keeping it pretty general for the purpose of this presentation. And they can either be a positive transference because of what we've been through and what we're carrying inside, or it can be a negative transference or counter-transference because of what we are dealing with inside ourselves. Some of it we are in tune with, and so we can have better outcomes, and some of it we're not in tune with. My hope and my prayer is that is that after this training, we can go back, and really self-reflect and say to ourselves, what is going on inside of me that is causing me to either transfer in certain ways to certain people, or what is going on inside of me that is causing me to counter-transference in such a negative way, or and how can I fix it, right? And how can I deal with it? And I think that's really quite important. So some of the, I'll give you an example of a negative transference, for instance. For example, if a father, right, it could be father, it could be a mother, but let's say in this case, if a father was a very authoritarian figure, right, which the individual found a difficult experience to be on the receiving end of, right? If this person was really being hurt by their relationship with their father, this person might transfer those feelings that they had with that father, right? Their experience with their father, they may transfer these difficult feelings onto someone else that they perceive as being in the authoritarian position that their father was in their lives, right? So that might trigger that, and they may transfer that onto that person. And again, keep in mind that it's irrelevant whether that individual has power or not. If that person, right, represents power, right, it's unconscious. So if the person just, unconsciously feels and processes and perceives this individual as that authoritative figure, then they're going to have a negative transfer onto that person. That would be considered a negative transfer. However, if the individual, for instance, had a wonderful experience growing up with their father, or for instance, with their mother, a very loving and wonderful experience, a very supportive experience, then it's possible that the individual may see the person different, right? So they're going to transfer in a much more positive way, right? They're not going to see this authoritarian figure as something that is a threat. They're going to see it as something that is good, and so you will go ahead and counter transfers or transfer in a positive way. And so this is called a positive transfer, when you're transferring positively. Okay. Next slide, Peter. So again, I just wanna reiterate that no one is exempt, right? Transference, again, it is a general phenomena that is acted out by everyone, including each and every one of us here today. It's constantly happening. We are constantly transferring because of our past experiencing. We are transferring on to others, and the different people, we will react differently to different people depending on what we've been through. And we will counter transference in everyone. And now I'm going back to being our spiritual care providers. We will, keep in mind, we will counter transfer because of our past experience. We will counter transference, counter transfer onto this inmate or this or the client or the patient at every visit. It's happening at every visit. So say, well, I didn't have this happen today, means that you just really didn't dig deep inside. But it's happening, and I think it's important that we realize it's happening, because again, it could be having a great effect on our visits and the outcome of our visits, which is fine. But if it's not, if it's having, you know, an adverse reaction, if it's having a negative impact on our visits, we should know about it, and we should go ahead and be able to work on ourselves or work with someone to help us through it. Next slide, Peter. So let's look quickly at the power, right? The power of transference, I call it. And why is transferring and why is recognizing transference important to us? Because it does contribute to the decisions that we make, not only in simple things like choosing friends and partners and you know, people to be, you know, to have relationships with, but it also is contributes towards those that we may not like without that person doing anything other than being him or herself. So a particular person may just be themselves, but there's something in the way they behave, in the way they are, in their attitude, in how they speak to us, right? That triggers something within us that may cause us to transfer or counter-transfer in a negative way toward them. And they're not really doing anything. They're being themselves. They're absolutely being themselves. And yet we are transferring in a very negative way because of something that is going on within us that we have not dealt with, okay? Next slide, Peter. So again, keep in mind, and I call this unconsciousness, keep in mind transference and countertransference are both unconscious feelings. So again, for the majority of us, all right, this is something that can be happening without us even knowing. It's been something that has been embedded into us since early in our lives, very early, for some of us as children, for some of us as teenagers, young adults. At some point, this something happened, some sort of conflict has occurred in us. It's an unconscious feeling. It's an unconscious phenomena. And we are doing this. We are transferring and counter-transferring um, unconsciously. We're doing it and not even noticing that we're doing it. And we are, and it's happening both on both sides. So it's happening to the patient, the client, the victim, the inmate, but also to the chaplain or the counselor. They may be experiencing these things toward each other and may not even notice that it's happening. Okay, they may not even notice that it's happening. An example of that, next slide, Peter. So an example of that would be that your patient or the inmate or the client may have had some sort of a painful experience, right, in the past, and finds that trusting people is difficult for them, right? So trusting people is difficult. And so therefore they mistrust, they're very mistrustful of you and what you're offering or what you represent. So an example of that, a real quick example of that is if an individual, and this has happened to me many times throughout my 25-year experience, especially in my first 15 years of experience in healthcare, which is, I go into the room, perhaps I had chapel and I was wearing my cleric collar or whatever, and I go into the room and I'm dealing with a patient. I encounter a patient that had a very horrible experience with a member of the clergy, all right, with a member of the clergy. And so I walk in as this chaplain. I'm wearing my cleric collar for whatever reason. This is actually an actual experience, by the way. And all of a sudden, they react simply to my presence. The fact that I am, quote unquote, a member of the clergy, the fact that I'm wearing this cleric collar, they are reacting and transferring onto me very, very negative feelings and attitudes, right? If I'm not aware of this, I may, because of maybe some negative experiences in me or my past, I may now counter-transference in a negative way, and we're gonna have a really horrible visit. We're gonna have a really, really horrible visit. I mean, it's just not gonna be productive at all. And so that's why it's important that this is aware of us. But because this person had some sort of an issue with clergy or with someone wearing a similar cleric collar, as me at that moment, they may transfer in a very negative way, okay? Because of what I'm offering, or in this case, what I was representing, right? A member of clergy, okay? And that was very, very, in many cases, traumatic for that patient. Next slide, Peter. So an example of the counter-transfers would be, you find yourself feeling under pressure, right, to placate or to reassure your patient or the inmate or the client over and above the way that you would normally feel or behave, okay? So again, because of your past experiences and because of the way they're transferring onto you, for instance, this patient, let's go back to the patient that I was talking about, the patient is reacting in a very negative way, in a very crude way. I'm sorry, somebody say something? In a very crude way to my presence, right? Because of that, if, I may now transfer, right? So what am I transferring over to them? Well, depending on what I've gone through and what their transfer is doing to me, the way they're treating me, I may be more harsh during the visit without knowing it. So it's something I have to keep an eye on. Or the opposite, I may go ahead and try to do the best that I can to try to relax this patient, right, or this client, and try to go over and above my duties and what I'm supposed to be doing to try to taper the individual's feelings toward me. And this could be okay, but it can also go overboard to the point where, I'm not really getting, I'm not really accomplishing my mission, right? With the individual, with the inmate or with the patient or with the client. I'm no longer behaving the way I usually behave, and I'm no longer within the visit feeling the way I usually feel, all right? So this could work both ways. Again, it could be positive, it could be negative. It all depends on how much control we have over this, how much we know about this, how much we know about ourselves in these situations, right? And that this is happening within us, and how we are able to control it. Next slide. So here's the big clue that we should be looking at. And this is, again, within ourselves, right? The big clue is that you may be experiencing a counter-transference during a visit. You may be experiencing a counter-transference, and you find that during that time you are experiencing these feelings, and really because of what this individual has transferred onto you, you find yourself acting outside of your normal pattern of behavior toward the patient or the client or the victim or the inmate, right? So you're not behaving as the way you usually do, because this person perhaps has triggered something in you negatively, right? Or, by the way, it can happen even if they trigger something new that is in a positive way. You know, sometimes it can be so positive that we start to almost get to that point, and I'll talk about that, where we actually kind of collude within the visit in many ways. And we really never get to allow the individual to really, you know, face their challenges or face the issues that they're dealing with, because we become so nicey nice during the visit, because we actually, this person triggers in us something that is so wonderful that we get thrown off, and we don't get the job done as well. So not interestingly enough, you know, having this positive transference onto us can also be unbeneficial, right? So we have to keep an eye on that. Again, it's about balance. It's about really keeping balance and making sure that we're not taken off track as spiritual care providers, especially while we're engaged. Next slide, Peter. So here it is. When I mean subtle, right? So subtle counter-transferring. You might not be aware. This is an example of very subtle. It does happen. It's so subtle that most people don't even realize it's happening. You might not be aware that you have allowed your boundaries to slip. You know, in other words, you know, because of what this person is transferring onto you. For instance, this transfer onto you has triggered something in you which makes you feel incredibly comfortable within the visit, to the point where you're offering more time, you're spending more time with this particular client, right? Over that which, you know, more above, right? The call of duty. You're spending much more time than usual, than what you would usually spend with a client, because of what has been triggered within you, right? The other side of that, next slide, Peter. So the other side of that would be that whatever this person has transferred onto you has caused you to then counter-transfer in a negative, right? A negative way. And so you realize that you are much harsher on this one particular client compared to the way you treat others, right? So they've triggered something in you, and in a very subtle way, you are counter-transferring to this person and treating them much harsher than you would usually, or perhaps even want to spend less time in the visit. You know, you want to get out of that visit, you know, as soon as possible, because this person has triggered in you something that is really negative, okay? The way they've transferred onto you has triggered something negative onto you, and you don't notice it, but you want to get out of that visit quickly. You don't want to deal with that individual, and so that again is not a good outcome. And next slide, Peter. So beware, right? So one of the things that you want to be very careful with and beware of is that forming this a positive countertransference can also have a downside, and I mentioned that a little earlier, right? And the downside is that because you've had this positive, the person has transferred onto you and triggered in you something that makes you feel good. You really enjoy being with this individual, and so in doing so, you might find yourself actually colluding with the individual and not really doing your job as a provider, which would be to encourage, your client in this case to face challenges that would be helpful to him or her. So that's something that we have to, again, be very, very wary of and very careful with. Next slide. So exploring is really important. Exploring is really important, and this is something that you can do, right? You can really explore your transferences with a seasoned chaplain, someone who is seasoned, especially in this area, a supervisor, a therapist, right? And you can do this in relation to the work with your clients. And this, again, this is can be really, really helpful, and it may reveal how these concepts may be affecting your visits. Okay, so if you really can spend some time and self-reflect or explore this with someone who's seasoned, someone who's very experienced, and who's for instance been doing chaplaincy for a long time, good chaplaincy work, this can help reveal in you what is going on with you during visits, or why a particular visit may be more difficult for you than others, or why a particular individual may be more difficult for you to handle than others. And again, this can really, really help in regards to dealing with your outcomes during your interactions with your client. Next slide, Peter. So this one here is titled "Easier Said Than Done," right? So even after everything that I'm sharing here, and I know that many of you perhaps have gotten similar trainings in the past, or those that come from a more social work background or counseling background, gotten some of this. But this is easier said than done, right? Transferring and countertransference is not, and let's keep that straight, it's not the easiest of concepts to understand. It's one of the hardest things. I try to get it to my students who I supervise during their first unit of CPE. And I also noticed that in many cases, when I've done a second unit or third unit, I've realized that many times these students have never been engaged in this way, have never been approached or had a lesson on transference and countertransference, which I think is bad personally. I think this is something that they should deal with during their first unit, and then continue working with it throughout the rest of their units. But I've been in situations where I'm teaching a unit 3, third unit of CPE, and the student has never ever been engaged about transference and countertransference. So although it is, it can be a difficult concept to understand, believe it or not, even veteran practitioners may find it difficult to recognize when they're transferring or counter-transferring. And finally, next slide, Peter. So, and again, in conclusion, right? So transference and counter-transference, again, as I mentioned before, they may seem like a difficult concept, but I tell you this, if you can go ahead and grab a hold of it, if you can go ahead and really be open to it, right, and take time even between your visits to sit back and even on a pad of paper or on your own, and if you can really just sit back and say to yourself, how did how did this person react to me and why, and how did I react to their reaction and why, right? If you can go ahead and do that, this becomes an incredibly, knowing about transference and countertransference becomes an incredibly useful tool that can be used effectively in enduring the spiritual care process. And that's it. I am open for questions at this time. Thank you, Peter.
Okay, thank you. So you're welcome to, please ask questions. You could also use a little raise your hand thing if you wish, or put your question in the chat. We'll just try all three of those. So who would like to?
Peter, I would like to go first, if possible.
Okay, Peter.
Dr. Miranda, thank you for sharing a very important topic with us. For
Dr. Grenion, it's great to see you again.
Pleasure for chaplain and client relationship, or therapist and client, or therapist and patient relationship. The point about transference can be positive or negative, a negative phenomenon. I like that. But what I really want to ask is, am I correct to conclude that you see transference and counter-transference as just an unconscious emotional reaction or phenomenon? Can transference and counter-transference also be a conscious emotional reaction?
So I would say this. So social workers and therapists obviously deal with transfer and counter-transference. In my experience and throughout my years of experience, they deal with it a lot more and they confront it a lot more, right, within themselves than spiritual care providers. Like I said, I've taught a fourth unit of CPE, and they've never been even at a seminar or any type of teaching on this. If you are doing it consciously, then you are on a worse path, I would say, right? Because now you have something that is conscious. You know it's hurting your ministry. It's hurting your visits in this case, let's say, as a chaplain, and yet you continue to do it and you fail to deal with it. So that would be a totally different area. And I've seen it, by the way, Dr. Grenion, I've seen it in doing individual supervision, where the person knows that this is an issue that they've had, and they'll tell you, well, I've had this since I was a kid because of how my dad, treated me, or my mom treated me, or, and so, or injustices in our past as children, right? And yet they haven't decided to do something about it. So I would say that obviously the person who is dealing with it consciously and not doing anything about it needs help and is obviously on a negative trajectory, right? As opposed to the person that it's happening, unconsciously or subconsciously and not noticing it.
Thank you.
You're so welcome. Great to see you.
All right.
I have a question.
Hey, Rev, how are you?
Hey, how
Which
are you?
Rev are you talking to?
I'm talking to Rochelle.
How you doing? You had made it. How you doing?
I'm doing
Good to see you. You had made a comment and you were saying, even with these transfers, you were saying it's good if you talk to a seasoned chaplain. And I would say that that's not going to happen. If you have not had the CPE training, you're not even going to be conscious that this is going on. So even that chaplain that you're talking to that's saying, yeah, they still don't know. They may know that they have it, but they don't know how to deal with it because they have not been trained on why you do what you do. They have had no training. So yeah, sometimes, godly experience may help you, this and that. But I think consciously they don't know how to change that behavior because nobody has trained them even while they're doing it. I mean, even stuff like, in CPE is crazy. They'll be like, why did you do that prayer? Well, I thought no, you didn't do that prayer for that person. That was about you and what you were dealing with. So until you've been attacked like that, I think that the average Joe Blow that's in chaplaincy is going to catch that. And absolutely. I would say in docs, it is not a requirement for you to have CPE training. Okay.
It's not required.
I have been nationally certified.
Wow.
And I will say that because of my training, it has helped me in my ministry.
Amen.
Immensely, because the first ministry is with me. You get what I'm saying?
I do.
So a lot of times, because we've been called and we got this great we never check out ourselves first.
Amen.
And so a lot of times, even with me relating in my counseling with the inmates, you talking about how things respond when they're talking all the time. There are things going off in your own head.
That's right.
If you haven't dealt with it and you don't even know how to deal with it, I really don't think, now counselors and all of them, you're right. That's part of their training, I think.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say that that's just been part of our training as chaplains, and depending on your calling, because every chaplain is not an ordained minister. Well, with Protestants, yes, we are. But I'm saying the chaplains that we engage with and deal with,
nowadays,
all of them, some of them just went because it's good pay. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm being very honest.
Yeah.
And you got good benefits and health care. It has nothing.
Praise the Lord.
I see you, Snyder. So, so really, I hear what you're saying, but it is a great thing. I think it would be nice if docs even pay for us. You heard what I said? They pay for us. That means we got, to have to just go through some training. Because it makes us, I think it really makes us better chaplains.
Yeah. Well,
Marcus,
Reverend Rochelle, I'm sorry.
Response?
So, Reverend Rochelle, it's you always bring joy to my heart. It's great seeing you.
You too.
Sorry that we can't see each other in person this time.
Right.
But you're absolutely right. And that's why I mentioned that as a board certified clinical supervisor, it's unbelievable to me that I might be teaching a third unit of CPE and the student has yet to be engaged in this type of training. And I say, well, how could that be? This should start early on within your first unit. And depending on the by the way, you said something important, depending on the supervisor you have, if you don't have a seasoned supervisor who's had this training, then you may never get it. And so perhaps that's why Peter and I know Brother Bruce, perhaps that's why they saw this when I presented it to them as something that they may want to bring to this conference, and I'm glad that they did.
Dorothy Pierce had a question.
I think maybe you answered part of this already, but I'm thinking about particular individuals. Okay, we're working within one individual, and you become mindful of what's happening, along the way with this transference and countertransference. When you meet with that person again on subsequent visits, is it natural to fall back into that pattern, or do things get resolved along the way, sometimes unknowingly?
Yeah. So yeah, do we throw caution to the wind and hope that you know the chips are going to fall where they may and it's going to work out? Yeah, you can go that way, but if you have already in your self-reflection, once you're done with the, you know, with the first visit, for instance, and you're doing your self-reflecting and you've caught on to what's happening here, you should be able to tweak certain things during your second visit. That's the key, right? To try to tweak things so that it doesn't continue to happen. And if you fail to do that, if you just say, well, I know what's happening, but let me just let it play out and see what happens, you know, that again, that is taking a chance. And I'm not sure if that's something that, you know, that kind of behavior that we want to engage in, especially when dealing with our clients or with a particular inmate or you know, I deal with a lot of victims of sexual assault, right? So there's a lot of transferring and counter-transferring going on. And so I'd like to go to believe that I can tweak some things because I do a lot of self-reflection after my visits. And so I'm hoping that I can tweak some things and try to, you know, make the following visit more productive.
Peter, can I just interject to Dorothy? So in CPE, there's this thing called verbatims. Because would you
yes, I remember them well.
right. So but the thing about it, that exercise allows you to actually see what's going on with that conversation. And once you have reflected and you see, you should be able to organize your next visit with that patient to take you to the next level. And that's that, and the next level is to get some resolve. You know what I mean? Because you can actually see the pattern, and the pattern may be you didn't respond well as a chaplain or give them good guidance. But through that verbatim, to me, that is a very good tool to help redirect.
Mm-hmm. I think what I'm asking primarily is it common for the pattern to repeat itself?
Yes.
You know, just and I'm sure it does.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and to be mindful of that. You know, that those
Yes.
those are patterns that we're not going to get resolved in an instant just because we're mindful of them.
No, and especially, and thank you, Reverend Rochelle. You're absolutely right. And going back to Rochelle before I get to Dorothy, one of the things that I did or I do as a supervisor is that as you know, as you're doing your verbatim, toward the bottom, you know, you have your pastoral theological reflection. Or what I've done as a supervisor is that I add a little area there where I tell them what was the counter, I mean, what was the transference and what was the counter-transference. I want them to try to find it in each visit because it is there. But if you don't ask the student to do that, they're going to go ahead and go right into their, you know, use their beautiful words to talk about their theological reflection or their pastoral reflection, you know, and then totally disregard, you know, were they aware about any counter-transference or transference during the visit? And it is happening. It's always happening. And Dorothy, you know, it's some visits are, you know, depending on the trauma or the issues that the inmate or the client may have been dealing with all their lives. This is not a quick fix, right? But one of the things I want you to understand, Dorothy, is that although they are in a really bad position and they're transferring onto you some heavy loads, right? The key thing is, how is it affecting you, and how is the effect on you affecting your visit? And that's really, you may not be able to control them for all intents and purposes, but you might be able to work with you, and that can be something that's done a little quicker than dealing with the actual ultimate outcome.
All right. Charlie Grimm has his hand raised. So Charlie.
And also Evelyn has been raising her hand as well.
Yeah. Evelyn and then Charlie. Evelyn, I think you were first.
Oh,
Hi, Evelyn.
Hi. How are you?
I'm doing good. Good to see you.
Piggybacking. It was great it's almost like a refresher with CPE, going back, and I was listening, and then I'm just going back in my mind with things that I learned in CPE. And when you said putting ourself, when you're talking about how when someone comes, inmate might come in and then it triggers your own past and how we inflect how we got over or how we dealt with our past to that inmate. And that might not be the right thing for that inmate, that he or she can overcome the area. Just because we did don't mean that they can do it in the manner that we did it. So I appreciate you bringing that to the forefront with us. And
Yeah.
it was something else that you, oh goodness.
Okay.
I'll come back because it was something else that you said that was just, I should have wrote it down.
Thank you, Evelyn.
That was,
Yeah, listen, I think that I think just going, while you think about it, Evelyn, just on your first point there, if you had, Lord forbid, if we had an abusive relationship growing up with our parents or with our father, right, and they were very, very verbally abusive, believe me that if an inmate is being verbally abusive in the way they react to you, in the way they're acting towards you, that can really have a major effect on how you counter transfer onto that inmate, onto that client. So I think that's incredible that you bring that up.
and the other thing I thought about, I wrote it down this time, learning to leave your job. When you go out that gate, leave your job at the gate. That's something that takes a lot of training, a lot of discipline. I learned in CPE how to do that, but it takes a lot of training, a lot of discipline to do that so that you can go on with your life outside of wherever you're working, whether it's docks or whatever institution, wherever you're working.
And I think that and I think that that's one of the points. And I think Holly, I can't see you on my screen here, but Holly will tell you I was her supervisor, and I was blessed to be her supervisor for one of her units in CPE. And I think that that's the point that I always made to her and to them, is that in recognizing transference and countertransference, we can really deal with issues, and we can do exactly what you said, Evelyn, which is to say, wait, this is really taking its toll on me. Let me go ahead and put it aside for a moment. And I think that that's why this is so important, and why I was adamant about bringing it to the conference.
Great. So, Charlie, I'm going to let you, you've been very patient here, waiting to ask your question. So go ahead.
Dr. Miranda, I'm so glad to meet you.
Hi, Charlie.
You bring me back, as Evelyn said, to my pastoral clinical days and training. It is so good, and it was so wonderful when I was going through it. It was but also the time of agony for me in terms of going through that whole process. This is the New York State Council of Churches. I'm chair of one of the committees of certification. This has always been a difficult bone of contention when we're talking to denominations and folks that want to come in and be chaplains. When we talk about you need pastoral clinical training, and we've had to deal with their excuses in terms of writing materials to us page after page why we should certify them, because they've had this course, that course, and everything else. So you've just reviewed for us why we do have that as a requirement, and we don't let that go by unless there's something unusual. I remember my first days of training in New York City when I took the very first courses, and you as a supervisor will appreciate this. I was trying, it was a Freudian supervisor with that background, and I was trying to figure out how I was going to pay for my analysis. I figured it was going to cost a lot of money. And then fortunately, my next training came at Bellevue Hospital with the chaplain there who was a Litterian. Thank goodness he saved me. That I didn't have to go through all that thousands of dollars to get analyzed. But this basic thing that you brought up in terms of transference is just basic to everything. that we've gone through. And as Evelyn had said, we get then some insight into what we do that we shouldn't do in our relationship and our spiritual care of folks. And thank you for that.
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, I'm, and as a supervisor, I can tell you that even though I may be aware of transference and countertransference, I am continuously a work in progress. And so I continue to self-reflect. I now deal mostly with law enforcement, officers and agents with Homeland Security investigations as well. And so I've had to deal with certain aspects of that because I growing up in what was considered the ghettos of Bushwick and Brooklyn, I had negative interactions with law enforcement. So here I am today as a chaplain for law enforcement, and Lord knows that I have had to deal with a lot of transferring and counter-transferring. And as my colleague Holly can tell you, she's here. They know me in our CPE. I teach for the Institute of Clinical Pastoral Training down in Florida. And they can tell you that I am the transference and counter-transference supervisor, right? I'm constantly trying to see what is the visit or the interaction doing within you. And I think that's really important for us to know that. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you for doing that for us, because it is basic to what we do, and we have to be on the job with that and thinking about it all the time.
Absolutely.
We had a question just about resources that might be helpful for the issue, and one suggestion was Pamela Cooper White's book, Shared Wisdom.
Okay.
But this person asked if, Marcos, you had any other suggestions of things that you read.
That's a good question. I do have a list that I've used, books that I would have my my students get that. I can pull up that list at some point and get it over to you before this before the day's over, before this is over, the conference, and we can maybe get it to everybody.
Great. We can send that out along with the PowerPoint and the recording.
More than welcome.
So I see Sheila has her hand up.
Yeah, and I think Carl had his hand up as well.
Oh, okay. Sheila, then Carl.
Good morning. Thank you for that presentation. I just wanted to note that I have experienced counter-transference in a positive way. For instance, my father stands about 6'5", and he's a very big man in physical stature, and also he's a giant of a man in spirit. And our relationship has always been a bit complicated. And in dealing with my father and those complications, it prepared me to deal with men who operate and move the way he does. And I find that type of personality in the prison system. And when, certain men approach me in a certain way, I'm not intimidated. I can stand toe to toe and eye to eye with them. So counter-transference can also work for the betterment.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's the positive transference that we were talking about. So again, the key thing to Sheila is that we're always transferring. We're always transferring. I mean, even within your families, at the dinner table, you're transferring. You could be sitting having lunch with someone at a cafeteria, and just by the way they're eating or by the way they're chewing their foods, you know that you can actually be, counter-transferring, and transferring, because of that. It might bother you. It might trigger in you something that you remember from the past that bothered you. But yeah, positive transferring is where we all hope to go, to get to that place where we can reach deep down inside, find those things that were positive to us during our time as children, but also during our time of academia, and use that to be able to be of a blessing to others. Thank you, Sheila.
So I'm going to turn now to Carl, and then we'll take one more question after Carl before we take a short break to prepare for Holly. So Carl?
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Marcos.
Hey, Carl.
I've taken a number of trainings over the years, and this was as clear a summary, I might almost say exhaustive summary, for an introduction of what transference and countertransference is. My one concern with the presentation and with the Council of Churches approach to interviewing chaplains is the almost exclusive focus that CPE is the only thing out there that effectively prepares people to deal with these issues. I do have a little concern with that. Before ministry, before my MDiv, long before chaplaincy, I took my master's in counseling psychology. I had 1,500 hours of supervision, had national certification, and worked as a primary therapist for county mental health for a while. This is nothing that's really particularly new to me. And the other experiences I had from credentialed and qualified and approved trainings have no standing whatsoever when I came to the Council of Churches for vetting and approval for Doc's chaplaincy. I would argue that the training and the experience from other sectors should at some point be considered, if not simply considered, then perhaps even equivalent at some level. Right now, the standards deny that equivalency. That's a concern I have. My experience says that there are other avenues, but there does not seem to be that allowance or latitude within my experience of ministry, denominational or chaplaincy or otherwise.
So I'd like to answer that question, Carl, if I could.
Sure.
There actually is in our criteria an equivalency to CPE. If you look at the criteria, and we will consider that. Unfortunately, most people who present the equivalency don't offer something which is equivalent. And, but it has to do with, you know, the level of supervision and training. But for the most part, we do default to a unit of CPE at least, because we think that's the most adequate. But we do allow in the criteria consideration for other equivalent training. It's just that many times what gets presented to us as an equivalent is not an equivalent.
No, I'm not disagreeing with that at all. I've seen that before ministry and during my time in ministry. I also served as a hospice chaplain, and they self-credentialed as an agency. There were people who presented themselves for interview on openings that really and truly had nothing more than a purchased piece of paper that looked nice. No real formal training, no experience or supervision. And it's unfortunate that there are people that are confident that amounts to a credential when in truth it does not. I absolutely agree with you.
All right. We have one other statement, Charlie, and then I think we're gonna try to move on. Charlie, you had your hand up again. Charlie, you need to unmute.
No, what I wanted to say was to back up what you said, Peter. As chair of the committee, we would have candidates come in who would try to give the equivalency. And what I thought was missing, although they had good training, as Carl has said, and Carl has good training and he has his certificates, what was missing was the spiritual element. And it just wasn't there. And that's part of what we're doing. We're talking about spiritual care. I emphasize the word spiritual, and that's what it's all about.
Just to say one other thing too, we've turned down certified candidates or candidates for certification who had 4 units of CPE, even 8 units of CPE. So CPE is not the be all and end all. It's the total package here. And, you know, we look at a lot of different things, but just because you have CPE doesn't get you certified.
I agree. Yeah, I agree with that's what you have said, Peter.
I'm glad you
Yeah.
said that, because I was going to say, you know,
Right.
could one of the main ingredients is that they love Jesus? I'm just saying, because I mean, in the midst of all of it, sometimes we can just like go over the top, and I'm not saying, I think it's great that we have high standards, right? I just wish that it could reflect in our pay. Because, and I'm not, you see, y'all being funny, because I sit by people who literally was just picked out something, and we're all on the same playing level, and it's sometimes, and I'm not saying that you know, that's not good, but I almost think sometimes if we're going to keep making the bar go up for the Protestants, that somebody needs to talk to our union rep to make sure that there's a difference in our pay, because really the other chaplains, they're not trained.
Yeah.
Can I say
Okay.
something?
We're going to have to conclude here, but I just wanted to make one other comment here. This is from Terry Culbertson, who just said she was grateful for this training. But Terry, would you mind just sharing a word about what you said in the chat?
Yeah, group, I wrote in the chat, I'm just so grateful for your comments. As a supervisor, I wrote in the chat, I've been attacked by area pastors who say we deserve to have these positions by virtue of our ordination. They have no education. We really believe in holding the high standard here at SUNY Upstate. And one of the things that we've worked very hard on in upstate New York across the entire region is to strengthen the CPE offerings. We now have an accredited program at Rochester General, as well as Strong Memorial. Sisters, Albany Med. Here at Syracuse, I have somebody in training to be a supervisor, so we've doubled the number of units that we provide. And we also have a docs unit here, inpatient, that, you know, if there was a docs chaplain or it was being required, that would be like a nice, I think, complement to their, you know, their position. But it was just so wonderful to hear you all be so affirming of CPE. I just made my day.
Well, Terry, I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I did not know some of those programs. I don't think those programs are generally known across the area.
Well, they're actually in the directory, and there's another program that was just accredited down in the southern tier. It's a hospice program, Care First, I think it's called. So we bounded together, those of us in upstate New York, to try to make sure that we are continually training people to go into supervisory education. And that might just be something for the group to think about in the future, if there's any person that shows that skill and that gift. The process for certification has changed since 2018 in ACPE. I think it's probably for the better. My person's in what's called the old process, but it's got a better curriculum, and I think learning outcomes. And it's something you can, I know I did it along with my full-time job. It took me 6 years. It takes a long time. But if you have the passion and the call, the need is there. The need is there. So I just want to say thank you. You guys have made my day.
Terry, could I just interrupt that? Maybe down the road, Terry, that you could do a presentation for us somewhere with our group, Peter, about what she has done and that whole, what has changed in the CPE.
Sure, so certainly do that. And I want to affirm what's been said about counter-transference and transference. And definitely it's key. Otherwise, that's where the lawsuits, the damage, and the problems come. I mean, we only have to look at Dannemora, frankly. as a good example. Yeah,
Yeah.
Miranda's nodding. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, thank you so
Well,
much.
so thank you very much. I wanted to thank Dr. Marcus Miranda for this presentation. He's
Everybody.
founder and president of the New York State Chaplain Task Force. And we are just so grateful to Marcos for that fine presentation. So
Thank you,
we're
Peter.
going to take about 1 minute here just to get set up for Holly. We're running just a couple minutes behind, but my aim is to get us done by 12. So I'm gonna stop this recording for a moment, so we can send segmented recordings to folks. And we'll be back on in just a minute, okay?